Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. This week, we're taking it to the max, the Kalamax. Kalamax the Stormsire is a teamer dino who wound up as the most popular precon commander from this year's precon cycle. As long as he's tapped, he'll copy the first instant spell we cast each turn, and he gets a +1 counter every time we copy one of our spells, and not just with his own ability. Kalamax's page is, of course, full of instants to copy, not to mention instants that copy, to help him pump up in some pretty incredible ways. Right off the bat, we have to pause and acknowledge something pretty important about Kalamax. Kalamax is one among several commanders who, once you start to tune him up even just like a little bit, you realize you've accidentally drifted into a bunch of infinite combos that you didn't even intend to use. Let's take a Reverberate as an example, a card you definitely want to include for Kalamax since it's an instant that copies spells. If Kalamax is tapped and an opponent casts some random instant or sorcery, say a Cultivate, then we can cast Reverberate targeting that Cultivate. Kalamax, while tapped, copies our instant and then gets a counter. So now our copy of Reverberate can target the original Reverberate, and then that copy can target the Reverberate again, and again. It's just repeating the same spell over and over, but Dino Buddy gets infinitely large as this happens. To exit the loop, all we have to do is have our final Reverberate copy target that original Cultivate, and voila, we have a supersized commander, not to mention 2 Cultivates. So this is when it becomes incumbent upon us as players to decide whether that's something we're comfortable with, because there are plenty of folks who don't like playing with infinite combos. I don't even mean they don't like playing against infinite combos, although that can certainly be true for tons of folks too. I just mean that there are plenty of people who don't want to play with infinite combos in their own deck. It's not something that they were looking for from this commander. They just wanted to sling some instants around. The thing is, in the case of Kalamax, I don't even know if we can get away with removing all of the infinite combos, even if we wanted to. So many of the pieces that cause the infinite combos are just so intrinsically tied into what this commander wants to do in the first place. Not only that, but the infinite combos have, for some folks, also become a really significant aspect of Kalamax's appeal. And besides, even if he does go infinite, he just becomes infinitely large. Infinity isn't going to win the game on its own. You still have to do something with it. So, knowing that this commander has a penchant for infinities, but also that it needs some extra steps to make sure that lightning strikes its target, let's see what tune-ups we can make. First things first, let's take Kalamax's average decklist from EDHREC and import it into the Architect deck-building website. As always, any swaps we make must either be cost-neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. Usually a deck has so many creatures that they run off the page, but in this case it's the instants. We've got some clever tricks here, especially some neat ways to make sure that Kalamax can become tapped without just relying upon combat. It's also interesting to see some of these cards, such as the enchantments, that suggest a storm backup plan, in case the Stormsire doesn't get the ability to actually harness the storm's ire. Let's weather this storm in the following 3 ways. First, the storm colors. Second, we'll take a look at the terrain. And finally, we'll hear the thunder. First up, we'll look at some storm colors, aka the creatures. I'm going to make this part quick. I'm removing almost all of the creatures. Some of these are holdovers from the Kalamax precon, but they ultimately just get in Kalamax's way. The collection of Pyromancer cards here aren't terrible in and of themselves, but it's highly doubtful that we'll be pecking anyone to death with tokens like these. The tokens will most likely just end up being blockers, which isn't really compelling for us. We'll find answers to enemy aggro in another way. Melek is also too much mana for a very unwieldy payoff. Melek needs Melek's own deck to do Melek things. And on the subject of 6 mana, sorry Wart, but I'm tossing you too. I actually really like this card a lot, but I can think of cheaper ways to get our Kalamax tapped, not to mention to copy spells. Then there's Lunar Mystic and Glade Muse, which serve the function of, allegedly, helping us draw extra cards. The thing is, Lunar Mystic costs extra mana to do that, so thank you, but next. And Glade Muse, offends my inner color pie philosopher. In the words of Tamar Braxton, why is she green? Regardless, this is not a benefit that we want our opponents to have. And yeah, I'm not done. Goblin Electromancer is a cost reducer for instant and sorceries, but we're going to talk about mana and our curve in the next section. For now, rest assured that we will find other methods of managing our mana. Dualcaster Mage is next, a creature version of the copy effects like Reverberate. But if we want that effect, we want it to be an instant so that Kalamax can potentially take advantage of it. We don't want it as a creature. Dualcaster Mage is an awesome card in decks that can abuse the fact that it's a creature, but this just doesn't happen to be one of them. Finally, my last two cuts have a bit to do with budget. We're talking about Seedborne Muse and Hullbreacher. Hullbreacher is so stinking popular from the new set that it is showing up in average deck lists all over the place. However, I'm not going to assume that everyone has this card right now. It's chopped. Then Seedborne Muse. This one I think I'll have to justify a little bit more than the others, which is fair. The card's obnoxious in multiplayer. Like, hey, Wizards of the Coast, if you want to know how to make good white cards for Commander, take a cue from how well this card scales to multiplayer environments and apply that lesson to white cards. Stop letting green get all of it. In any case, this is a great card to help you keep up mana on enemy turns, so Kalamax can get those instants at the ready. But the thing is, it also untaps the Kalamax. Now, that's not the worst thing in the world, obviously. There are plenty of ways that Kalamax can become tapped again. Crew a copter, bang a drum, that sort of thing. Seedborne can be such a powerful effect that, frankly, I would absolutely believe any Kalamax player who says that it is worth running, even despite the fact that it non-bows with Kalamax, unless and until you find one of those other tap-dancey pieces in your deck. The thing is, though, if you're making this deck for the first time, a $12 card that has some extra hoops to jump through doesn't need to be a high priority. So thus, we're cutting it to make some room. Now, this is usually the part in the video where I would probably add in some creatures to replace the ones that I just cut, but nah, I'm not gonna do that here. Kalamax is not gonna share the spotlight. He needs spells, not extra bodies crowding up his stage. The lesson to learn here is that Kalamax is a very commander-centric deck. A lot of the strategy really revolves around his participation. Having a backup plan to that is good, but some of these backup plans just take away from what would allow Kalamax to thrive if plan A is to succeed in the first place. That was a lot for the first section, but really, we're just getting started. Let's go now to our next section. A storm can't strike unless the conditions are exactly right, so let's check out the terrain. In other words, our mana curve. When I first uploaded the average list, my initial reaction to the phrase 34 lands at the top of the page was just complete and utter disbelief. That's way too low. We gotta fix that, right? But believe it or not, during playtesting, I actually found myself softening quite a bit on that initial reaction. Kalamax does need a reliable base of mana to make sure that he can come into play in the first place, but once he starts doing his thing, man, he digs really, really well. Any spell that untaps 2 lands actually untaps 4. Any spell that draws you 1 card actually draws you 2. And there are a lot of little cantrips in here. I still want to examine our mana base to make sure that we can actually reliably get Kalamax out onto the battlefield in the first place, but I also just decided to take the cue from the low land count here. This is a slim deck that could actually really run the risk of flooding out if we're not careful. We're not trying to have a bunch of lands and cast really big instants to copy, but rather just a bunch of smaller ones that Kalamax will amplify, and that over time become a lot greater than the sum of their parts. So yeah, the first culprit is Mnemonic Deluge. 9 mana? 9? To copy a spell 3 times? That could be spicy in theory, but it's too much mana. And frankly, we'd probably have to copy an opponent's spell to get the best use out of this card, since most of our cards are just, cantrips. This can be a cool card, just not here. Starstorm is another one. Even if Kalamax copies it, how much mana do we have to pay to make this a very beneficial or reliable board wipe? I'm just going to swap in Blasphemous Act instead. I don't care if that one's not an instant, it's an amazing card. These next two involve card draw, but their costs just scare me. Not just their mana costs, but their timing restrictions as well. We're talking about Return of the Wildspeaker and back up on the page, Channeled Force. In theory, these will draw a lot of cards when copied with Kalamax. The problem is that, unlike several of our other instants, they rely a little bit too much upon Kalamax being in play to actually achieve their full potential. Given the target that'll be on Kalamax's back, we may not get the chance at all to tap out for big instants like these while he's in play. So I want to throw in some other options here instead, especially by leaning into some more interactivity with our opponents. Supreme Will is thus my first addition. It can help us dig for the best cards among our top 8, or it can serve as nice protection for Kalamax. Our Dino Buddy makes us a very nice diverse spell. I'm also adding in Nature's Claim. Even if one opponent were to gain 8 life from this, Kalamax just literally doesn't even care. It is extremely efficient removal, and our propensity for infinities doesn't even blink at life totals. Next is Snap. This isn't a permanent form of removal, but is rather a kind of tempo play. But that's ultimately what this deck kind of becomes, isn't it? A tempo deck. This card can bounce 2 baddies and refund us by double. Heckin' rad! Speaking of mana, Mana Morphos. This card was a lot more expensive when Kalamax first debuted, which I think probably led to it being overlooked at first, but don't let it continue to be buried. It's not that bad on price after the Double Masters printing, and Kalamax can use it as card draw or as a delicious thing to copy multiple times for a huge spelltastic turn, especially with our backup plans like Gutter Snipe or Thousand Year Storm. Finally, I'm going to look again at the mana in this deck. I've decided that I'm okay with the low land count because this deck is just so spell heavy and storm possible that too many lands really can stall the strategy out by flooding. However, I do want us to have more acceleration. I'm throwing in a Kodama's Reach to go with the Cultivate. I don't want to add too much more 3 mana ramp past that though, so to that end I'm adding in the 3 on-color talismans here, because 2 mana is a great spot for a mana source that can get us Kalamax into play as early as turn 3, and they can give us mana right away to help cast spells on subsequent turns. That's actually pretty big for Kalamax. We really don't like tapping out, so it's nice for our mana sources to complement that. I'm also tossing out Commander Sphere in exchange for a different 3-mana rock. I want a Cultivator's Caravan here because it taps for mana and it's a tap outlet for Kalamax right away. Remember, we can crew this with Kalamax even if our Dino Buddy has Summoning Sickness. Alright, it's time for our final section, Part 3, where the Dino goes boom. A tapped Kalamax is just instantly scary. No pun intended. When he's tapped, any single copy effect from us means that on our next turn, we're untapping with an infinitely large dino. We added in some interactivity in the last section to help mitigate against enemy aggression on that regard, but in this section, I want to kind of hone in on what can make Kalamax so scary when the stars align. After all, just because Kalamax can become infinitely large doesn't mean it's instantly lethal. First things first, let's remember how Kalamax can get big with copy effects. Full confession, I made it through 2 entire drafts of this script before I realized that Fury Storm was not in the original average deck list. I'm still kind of picking my jaw up off the floor for that, in fact. Fury Storm's an amazing card, especially with partner decks, but what is especially amazing here is that when we cast Fury Storm, it will provide a copy of itself, and the copy can target the original Fury Storm card. Just like we saw with Reverberate earlier, this whole copy loop can go infinite for an insta-big Kalamax. Even if we don't have Kalamax in play, if that Ral from the average list is out on our battlefield, he can also go infinitely crazy and zap life totals right away too. So yeah, Fury Storm, play it. Moving on, I want, at minimum, at least one sincerely dangerous combat effect in this deck for when Kalamax has an opening but hasn't quite gotten the opportunity to make a copy loop to get bazillions of counters. So I'm adding in Unleash Fury. The timing on this thing is hilarious, because Kalamax can attack and then in combat would be tapped, and if he goes unblocked, we can cast this, copy it, get a +1 counter, and then double Kalamax's power to 10, and then the next copy will double his power to 20. In one attack with one spell, and if he has gotten even one extra counter before this point, that is an insta-lethal commander damage situation. My initial draft of this deck also included some stuff like Rush of Blood and other similar effects to really lean into this possibility, but I eventually backed off on some of those other ones because that tack can be so aggressive and doesn't always line up with a lot of what the rest of the deck's missions will be. I still think we want at least one of these though, just so our opponents are always afraid of Kalamax in combat. I want to throw out another nastily diverse spell in here too, Simic Charm. This thing is a genuine blowout. If Kalamax goes unblocked, this can be 2 mana for a sudden +7 pump, but alternatively, it can also bounce 2 things away. And best of all, it even has some optional hexproof. Kalamax likes all of these options. Now, a reminder that when you copy a modal spell, you can choose new targets, but you have to keep the same modes. But the modes on this charm make that still totally worth it. Alright, so what about when Kalamax does go infinite crazy? There's a Chandra's Ignition in the main deck to help his infinite cosmic power turn enemy life totals into an itty-bitty living space. Kalamax won't always have an opening in combat after all. Power without trample or evasion just means he gets chump blocked for days. So to go along with that Chandra's Ignition, I'm including a Soul's Fire. To be honest, this is actually a pretty funny spell for Kalamax even if he doesn't get infinitely huge. If he can tap and cast this, that's a minimum of 10 damage for 3 mana divided nicely across some possible targets. And that's before we even consider him when he does have additional counters or when there are additional copies of this spell. But best of all, if he does have infinite counters, then yeah, our enemies are going to get burnt to a crisp. Now, notably, Soul's Fire, just like Ignition, does target our Dino friend, which leaves the door open for people to potentially disrupt us by removing Kalamax before our spell can resolve. So on that note, I'm including a hilarious little extra instant here, Kazul's Fury. It can also be played as a land, which is really nice flexibility, but mostly it's another backup plan for us to help hit someone with our huge dinosaur when it can't get over the top of some pesky blockers. Now, Now importantly, this card sacrifices Kalamax as part of its cost, so Kalamax won't be tapped and thus won't copy the spell. However, since he's sacrificed as part of the cost, that also means that this spell is a lot harder to disrupt because Kalamax can't be removed in response. He's already gone. So between the Soul's Fire and the Kazul's Fury, we've got some cool benefits and trade-offs, and both of them just give us a lot of cool extra reach. And by the way, if we use another one of our copy spells on Kazul's Fury, we don't have to sacrifice another creature. The copy will deal the same amount of damage as the first one. Finally, the last special card I want to add here is an extremely diverse little cantrip. That's the card Shadow Rift. Kalamax can use this to attack freely, since he can attack, become tapped, and then get through with Shadow, or he can just use it to go unblocked whenever he's gotten Super Swole. Or he can also just use it to draw 2 cards for 1 mana. That's a lot of power packed into one single cantrip. And that ought to do it. Here we have our final list. You can find a link to it in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed this time with Dino McLightning Bud, and if you have any other recommendations for your fellow Stormsires, make sure you leave them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.